Yes.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Nilay Özok-Gündoğan.
Thank you so much for being with us, Prof. I'm excited. And you've got one of those not artificial backgrounds, but sort of soft gauze, Vaseline lens, foci on your face that you get in classical Hollywood with female actors. In the background, it looks like a domestic setting. Have I got that
It is
right?
a, that's right. It's a domestic setting. It's my office. That's where I work most of the time. But the Hollywood light, I think that's how you described it, is because my camera is so dirty. I often touch it with, hands with moisturizer or things like that. So there
Oh,
is really nothing, no filter. It is just my camera is so dirty.
that's so funny. And folks, I should say that I've run out of concealer. So although we are recording in video, I'll actually transform this into audio. Okay.
Mhm.
And also, so you won't see the lens at work. And Tani has just decided to start typing.
Oh,
Tani is one of the podcasts. She's very interested in you, Prof. She's looking at you. You can't see
oh.
her at the moment, but she is staring at you very close by, and she has a paw on four keys. So I may have to take some sort of action. You know, this is awful, but spraying her with a bit of water is often,
Oh,
I know,
I understand. Yeah,
I
I have
know.
two cats, and I'm just curious what she's really typing with those two four keys. What
Well, at
what
the
is the message
moment,
that she's delivering?
this is the good thing. Right now, she's just leaning a paw on them and putting, you know, when they put their little jaw on top of their paw,
I
and
know,
it's so adorable, and you just feel like crying. That's what she's doing,
I
and
know.
she's pointing her ears at you. So there's something about you, Prof, that is really interesting to her.
Maybe she understood that I'm a cat person.
Perhaps that's it.
Hmm.
Maybe she's hoping one or two of your cats will put in an appearance, though I think the door is closed, from what I can tell. The
And
problem
this
for me
close.
is that if I close the door, the other podcat scratches on it until I open it. And my
And
heart,
that might happen here too.
yeah, and my
Yeah.
heart can't resist them. Now, maybe we'll get back to the topic of pussycats and how wonderful they are. But that's not principally what we're here to do. And I wanted to start with asking you my, I was going to say classic question, but that's slightly pompous. The question I put to all my guests, which is to inquire as to what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on apart from the fact that you have a very dirty lens?
My defense, yeah. And at the beginning, I think I was supposed to also give you some more information on who I am or where I am, where my position is. I'm an associate professor of history at Florida State University, just to clear things out here.
Yep.
So things that are dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, and
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of things. Dynamizing, it's just interesting from my everyday life. My daughter plays the trumpet,
Oh,
and
wow.
she's really, yes, that's one of the things that really makes me happy hearing her tunes, in random times of the day, going to her, concerts because she was at a summer camp. So just like listening to those tunes makes me really energized.
Yeah.
So it's one of the best things of my life nowadays. But there's another thing, I am deeply, engaged with this research of mine about the Ottoman mines, and I think we will have a chance to talk about those.
Hmm.
But even when I'm doing other things, I think about mines, mineral extraction, what is going on underneath the soil. So these are things that I am actively thinking about. But another thing that is, energizing. You say dynamizing, that I like that a lot. I think it's kind of hard for me to pronounce that. I'm gonna say energizing me is yeah, I love the vibe there. But another thing that is energizing me is, of course, there is a peace process in Turkey about Kurds. That's, energizing me, but at the same time intriguing and concerning at so many levels. And impeding, what is impeding me is the political processes in the Middle East right now. Um, often I teach the Middle East knowing that it's not like a rose garden. There's always something happening because of the region's history. But currently there's an active war going on, but also the developments in Syria in the past couple of months effectively ended the Rojava project as it was. So that has been concerning to me, the current government formation and the type of government that is emerging in Syria. I find that concerning
Mhm.
in terms of the autonomous development of Kurds and self-determination. And that is also one of the things preoccupying me. But what is preoccupying me is also I am the editor of the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. That is keeping me quite busy because this journal is our major journal in the field. But increasingly, it is becoming hard to get people to do, the type of work that we do, like getting reviews. So it's something that I really like to do. It's kind of the thing that I find interesting. If I were not a professor doing historical research, I see myself doing editorial work. That's something that I really like to do. But the structural constraints of our occupation, it is making it increasingly hard because people are overworked. And there's a lot of precarity in our field, and it almost feels unfair to ask people to do more work in unpaid ways. But at the same time, I think it is important to maintain the scholarship in the ways that we imagine. But it is becoming increasingly difficult. More than I focus on the actual content of the scholarship that I read, it's like, managerial work that I have to perceive people, send multiple notifications, and that is preoccupying me. And it's kind of sometimes annoying because everybody wants their piece to be reviewed, but no one wants to review articles. It's hard to find that balance. And what I find interesting, okay, that is like, I think I already talked about some of the things that I find interesting. So I don't want to just make up something just to answer this question. There's a
Oh,
lot of interesting things happening here.
and I should say the word dynamizing is very common in Romance languages, but much less so in English. And so lots of native English speakers think that I'm saying dynamiting, like blowing them up.
Oh, but I heard it right? You
You
said
heard it
dynamite.
right, and energizing is a perfectly good word. It's just that dynamizing, as you say, sounds so exciting in some way.
Yeah.
That's a lovely story about your daughter and the trumpet. I don't suppose she's at home and willing to give a little recital, is she?
She's home. She's not awake yet.
Ah, so
And I hope she would. I will try to actually do this. That would be so lovely because she's now in the jazz band
wow.
and the tunes that she plays are really so impressive.
Well, if she wakes up and she makes herself known and she feels like playing for like even just a minute would be very
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah,
Even dynamiting, perhaps dynamiting, who knows? On to the
yeah,
other things you mentioned. One of the issues that journals are increasingly confronting is actually that not just manuscript submissions, but reviews are written with artificial intelligence because people don't
mhm,
have the time or the will to
yeah,
engage in the careful preparation, not just of a manuscript itself, but of a report on it. I wanted
yeah.
to ask you if I, sorry, go
Mhm.
ahead.
No, I wanted to say something. Yes, the AI problem
Mm.
is becoming increasingly difficult to handle as an editor. I really have no problem if reviewers, use AI just to type things, get things, written in a better language without spending more time. But what I have problem is it's very obvious when someone gets the AI to do the thinking when they write the review. That is the main problem for me.
I wanted to ask you about Kurdish studies
Yeah.
because this is part of the journal, part of your own work, but also an area where you and a colleague, a fellow scholar, have done a fair bit of work talking about the decolonial turn. There's a special issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly that you put together with Mushuk Kurt, apologies for the pronunciation, on this topic. So could you tell us a little bit about the current state of Kurdish studies and where there is a decolonial turn?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I co-edited this with my colleague and friend Mashuk Kurd. So the idea of the issue came from a series of workshops that he co-organized a few years before we published this special issue. So this is something that it's almost working on Kurdistan. As an historian, I normally enjoy historical research dealing with documents, but it's the state of the field or this Kurdish studies literally forced me to think actively, nonstop about the Kurdish studies and epistemological and methodological issues in relation to Kurdish studies and also institutional. Now, I'm based in, North America, and this is where I received my postgraduate education. And so I have been thinking actively about Middle Eastern studies in the United States. And Middle Eastern studies in the United States, even though it is area studies and it has this Cold War background to it, it's still organized around nation states areas or nation states perspectives. You will have Turkish studies, Iranian studies, Arab studies in different national subcategories, but Kurdish studies has no institutional basis in the United States. So maybe it's counterintuitive to start with, with an institutional answer to an epistemological question that you ask, but it is at the core of some of the epistemic issues that we deal with here,
Right,
because we had this conversation briefly at the beginning. Yes, as a Kurdish studies scholar, I have to give more context. As a Kurdish studies scholar, I have to introduce who the Kurds are. So Kurds are very well known in North America as political actors, but not so much as, a part of an institutionalized scholarly discipline.
right.
Now, decoloniality, what do we mean by decoloniality when it comes to the Kurdish studies is the relevant question, because in these fields, in nation state oriented areas that we talked about, they all had their own post-colonial turn somehow. But in Kurdish studies, years ago, I wrote this op-ed, which really was, it reflected my frustration because as Kurdish studies scholars, we have to deal with two realities competing at some point, which is we want the Kurdish studies to be institutionalized and be a part of the larger area studies institutional structures, but at the same time, we have been critical of the area studies perspectives as it is organized in North America and elsewhere. So the dilemma here is how do we open room for Kurdish studies while not falling into the trap of the area studies perspectives, which had been long criticized in so many different and great ways. Now, what does epistemic decoloniality mean in Kurdish studies? It has to bring us to the question of what does coloniality or what coloniality means in Kurdish context and Kurdistan. Now, there is a couple of different unique ways in which we have to understand the colonization of Kurdistan. And the most important one being that often we describe the colonization of Kurdistan in relation to four nation states, meaning historic Kurdistan being, partitioned into four nation states: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran after World War I, and that creating what well-known scholar Ismail Beshikci describes as Kurdistan is an international colony. It's not just an internal colony. It is an international colony because there is like four competing nation states. Now, It's the idea behind the special issue was twofold. How do we explain Kurdish coloniality? Because do the concepts, frameworks, ideas, conceptual toolkit that come from Euro-American experiences of colonization, do these concepts help us understand Kurdish coloniality or colonization of Kurdistan? And the second thing in relation to this is once we understand the parameters, historical development, and epistemological nuances of the coloniality of Kurdistan, how can we imagine epistemic decoloniality? What does it mean? Are
Mm.
we talking about decoloniality in terms of the classical way in which we think about decoloniality, like Eurocentric concepts and imagination imposing on our thought processes when we think about non-Western, non-European contexts? But are we also talking about coloniality and in relation to that decoloniality in relation to these nation state contexts and nation states and their forms of colonization of Kurdistan? How do we conceptualize Turkish colonization and what is the ways in which Turkishness shaped scholarship on the Kurds, or the way that Kurds think about Kurdistan, Kurdish history in light of nation state frameworks or from a nation state perspective. So these are some of the questions that we try to ask. And, rather than answering these, because it is an evolving field, it is literally, we just started to think about decoloniality in Kurdish studies in the past 5 years or so. So just to understand, okay, how do we define coloniality in the Kurdish case? This is a question. Help us answer this question. And how do we think about epistemic decoloniality in a way that is unique to the Kurdish plight or the historical developments that created Kurdish coloniality, but at the same time does not fall into the trap of nativism, but it is more, comparative in terms of different colonial experiences.
Inevitably, this takes me back more than a century to the end of the First World War and the end of the Ottoman Empire. This is something you've written about a lot, both at the level of encyclopedic entries explaining to people what the heck the Ottoman Empire was, but also in Kurdish terms. Darling, no, no, she is biting the cable that is
Oh,
keeping us connected. No, darling, I have to, no, darling, darling, no, no, no. This
oh,
is so difficult when you love them so much. But for instance, I've had to lock away the Wi-Fi because they bite through the cable. They both like eating. Darling, okay, I'm going to have to bring out the water bottle. I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm such a bad daddy.
no, you're not.
Uh, so sorry,
Cats are very strong-willed.
oh, there is that saying or something like it. It's their world. We're just living in it.
Yeah.
Anybody who
And we
knows,
love it, don't we?
well, this is the other thing. I read recently that they were domesticated thousands of years after dogs were. And so they just have so much more independence.
I know. Can I say one thing about cats before we forget our chain of thought? The other day, for the first time, we were watching a documentary with my husband, Azad, and we watched this thing about the sand cats, and I hadn't heard about it before. I don't know if you did, in Arabian Peninsula. This is the cutest thing ever, this tiny little cat. And it's just, how does it even survive in those conditions? I would really recommend you check it out because it's very cute and very interesting.
Wow. Well, as we speak, I've just looked it up on a browser, and yes, and definitely a cousin of my little guy, the orange and vanilla one.
Oh, yeah.
And with good camouflage, with good camouflage.
Definitely. Yep.
So the Ottoman Empire, absolutely crucial in world history for centuries, and still crucial today in its after effects. And of course, as always, Britain plays a totally heroic role in this. Ho, ho, ho. Very embarrassing given my accent. Could you give us a bit of a spin on the Ottoman Empire and specifically what it meant for the Kurdish people? And I say this in the context of also hoping that you'll tell us a bit, perhaps in the next question, about your book, The Kurdish Nobility in the Ottoman Empire. A wonderful book that I've had the great opportunity to make my unsteady way through as a reader.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, the Ottoman Empire, it is interesting because I went to school in Turkey. Let me just start with a little bit of personal
Yes.
uh, connection here. I grew up in Turkey, and of course, all we learn at history classes, I don't know if it is still the case, in history classes was about the Ottoman Turkish, Islamic Ottoman Turkish history. So at that time, I found Ottoman Empire as a topic very boring because it is like, typically any conversation on Ottoman background is related to some sort of Turkish Islamic political standpoint, which was not really something that I felt close to. And that created some sort of, distance for me between history as a discipline and the Ottoman Empire specifically as a topic. That's why I studied political science in undergraduates, and I took only a few history classes.
Oh,
My connect yeah, and my connection to the Ottoman history was through Kurdish history. So I ended up being an Ottoman historian to study the history of Kurds and Kurdistan. But hey, I ended up liking Ottoman Empire and its history quite a bit. And so the relationship might have, changed now. I am interested in Ottoman history and I want to understand Kurds and Kurdistan within it. Now, Ottoman Empire, we often talk about it in, like, we emphasize its longevity because it was established around the 1300s and it lasted until the end of the World War One. And just its longevity is fascinating to a lot of historians beyond the Ottoman historiography. How did an empire survive for so long? What are some of the strategies, governing mechanisms that they use to survive for one dynasty for such a long time period? And another thing that makes the Ottoman Empire really interesting and fascinating is the mere area of the geographic scale where they ruled
yeah.
and which made it by definition and a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multi-linguistic entity. And oh my goodness, she is very cute. And the this is like a very curious question for us for historians. How did they rule this
Yeah.
diversity? Did they use violence? Did they assimilate these different groups? And did they really, how were they so successful in managing diversity? But here there is like a historiographical dilemma, or not a dilemma, but caveat that we have to really be careful, especially when we teach this to undergraduate students. Because these are all fascinating things. If you're interested in political structures and see this
Mhm.
empire and the, governing mechanisms that it used, it is not easy to be not fascinated by it, right? We want to understand. We want to
Yeah.
see how they did this. But at the same time, at the core of it, of course, we are looking at a political or a structure. It is hierarchical, right? It is hierarchical. It's not organized around modern notions of citizenship or equality until very late in its history. So there's a lot of fascinating things that you might find as a political theorist, as a cultural studies scholar, as someone who works on diversity, coexistence. So these are some of the things that make Ottoman Empire a very important case for understanding world history. And we also, when we see Ottoman titles like Ottoman Empire and Europe, we kind of pause for a second as Ottoman historians because Ottoman expansion started in the Balkans. So Ottomans were a part of whatever Europe meant in the 14th century was long before they were a part of the Islamic world. So that's why we tend to see Ottoman history as a key component of world history from the early modern period to the end of World War I. And when I teach this, it is really interesting. Students know that this is something that I really enjoy teaching. But when they ask me questions at the very first day, I make it very clear that, look, you will ask me a question about Ottoman military, Ottoman bureaucracy, succession, the harem, gender relations, but I will never be able to give you one answer. Because think about this. This empire lasted for 6 centuries. And how can you expect me to explain its military by just saying that this was what Ottoman military was about? So I have to give a lot of caveats as I answer any question in relation to the Ottoman institutional structures or anything related to that. And this, yeah. The second part of your question was what it meant for the Kurdish people. And I have to say that I really appreciated the way that you framed this question. You're the first person who asked me what it meant to the Kurdish population. The question is almost always asked the other way around. How did the Ottomans rule Kurdistan? So it is almost, it comes from center to the periphery, top down. So what did it mean to Kurds is a fascinating way of asking this question. So let me give you a little bit of background here because historians like to do that, right? So Kurdistan came under the Ottoman rule in the 16th century. And it was like an area between two competing imperial empires, imperial structures in the 16th century, the Safavid and the Ottomans. And it was within the context of the Ottoman Safavid, which is the empire in modern Iran right now, rivalry that Kurdistan became a part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, what does it mean to be a part of an empire in the 16th century? So it means a lot of different things depending on where you are situated, your like the ecology of the region, the distance, the elite formation. And Kurdistan at the time consisted of a lot of, decentralized ruling structures. These are like principalities, emirates, like noble ruling households, and also tribal structures within that. So coming under the Ottoman rule or being a part of the larger Ottoman's political structure, uh, for the Kurds, first and foremost, meant that they recognized the Ottoman authority as opposed to the Safavid authority. So it is like one or the other. And it is basically a declaration of loyalty, a recognition of the imperial power. What it meant in terms of everyday strategies of ruling or everyday strategies of administration really varied to the extent that some of the areas of Kurdistan really it was only a lip service to Ottoman authority. They didn't pay any taxes. They did not accept any, and this is the area that I'm specifically focusing on in my book. They did not really accept any Ottoman administrators. So it was mainly just like a declaration of loyalty, meaning that we didn't accept the Safavid loyalty, Safavid empire or imperial rule. So it could be as simple as that. But in other areas, Ottomans were able to have a better organized ruling strategy and more direct forms of governance. So long story short, this is something that I like to talk about. Ottoman administration was based on various modalities of autonomy. So it wasn't unique to Kurdistan. Like everywhere, they found the most functional way to govern the specific area under question. So for Kurdistan, it had its own unique ways, and at the core of the Ottoman rule in Kurdistan, and this was what it meant for Kurds to be a part of the Ottoman Empire, was to be recognized as, the autonomous rulers of their historic areas, their historic territories. I think in this early 16th century, this is what it meant for Kurds to be a part of the Ottoman Empire, to be recognized on their own terms to a great extent.
It's interesting because the so-called Moorish occupation of the Iberian Peninsula was violent and was ideological, Islamic, but the ideology included basically cultural relativism when it came to other religions. Jews and Christians could do what they liked. They didn't have the privileges that the invaders had. But if they wanted to hold their religious ceremonies and speak their languages, go right ahead, buddy. Yeah. So it
Yeah,
is interesting when you have these models that are really quite different, particularly in the white settler colonies that seek to destroy indigenous religion and language. Of course, very different in the case of somewhere like India or China, these vast countries where you can't really, if you're an imperialist, settle them and take them over. It's just not possible.
that is an interesting point, and I think it will come up at some point in today's conversation because, I talk about late Ottoman policy in Kurdistan, specifically in relation to resource extraction as colonialism, as I see this as colonial in its essence. And there I get some pushback from my colleagues who work on, the Americas and other forms of European colonialism elsewhere, because they think about settler colonialism as you described it, aiming to basically erase the local identity and local culture, indigenous forms of existence, which is definitely a common form of colonialism in various historical examples. But I think there is also historical variations, considering that the empire that we are looking at in this context is an empire that already had some relevance or some presence in the areas, but there is a change of ruling strategy from the 16th to the 19th century, where I think some new colonial logic emerges in line with modernity and the making of a modern state governmentality.
And that leads me to one of the unique features of your book, which is that it's political economic. This is you
Mhm.
getting back to your political science roots. I was an undergrad major, double major in history and political science. And sadly, the political science I learned was just institutional rubbish, voting patterns, political infrastructures. And the idea that you would learn something of Marxism, for example, was just absurd. Even economic history of a more moderate kind, you didn't learn. And one of the weaknesses of a lot of area studies that you talked about before is the fact that the so-called culturalist turn, with which I'm very sympathetic, has sometimes come at the cost of political economic approaches. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that extractive focus. Because, for example, in the Latin American context, the focus on religion and race often leaves out the political economic context. For the century up until the First World War, Britain was the most important political economic influence in Latin America. It's only after the First World War, with the First World War, that the US becomes central. This gets left out in lots of stories. If you walk around Latin America today, Prof, and you look at a drain pipe, or you look at some of the sewage, it'll say on the metallic parts, made in Sheffield, right? So sorry to drag it back to where I am and where I'm from, but I wondered if you could talk about the political economic context in the Ottoman world and what that meant in particular for the Kurdish nobility.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. And in parentheses, again, I don't want to get sidetracked, but my minor area in as a PhD student was Latin America and rural societies and rural transformation.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, since my advisor, Professor Donald Quadrant, Ottoman historian, he actually passed before I finished my
You mentioned this
dissertation.
in the book. It's very tragic. Yes.
It
Yeah.
is. And I finished with Nancy Applebaum, who is a Latin American historian. So I might have been influenced and inspired by her. So, about the political economy, yes, your point about political science, I agree with that. Interesting, though, in Turkey, the political science department that I went was mostly like political theory. There was a few American style, party systems, political systems, exactly, classes. I never took those. I didn't have any interest, but it was mostly political theory. And I think I maintained that in my soul as I became an historian. And yes, political economy. Now, let me just try to approach to this question as an Ottoman historian, as historian of Ottoman Empire who focuses on Kurdistan. Now, the Kurdish studies, as I said, is developing, but Kurdish history is still, it's not getting the attention that it needs to get because of the urgency of the political issue. Most people, new generations of scholars who do work on the Kurds and like work within the realm of Kurdish studies, they often focus on the contemporary era. There's a lot of great anthropological ethnographic work, there's a lot of cultural studies, diaspora, but history still is, it's slow. It is developing, but much more slowly than other disciplines. Now, that's why actually I'm an historian of Kurdistan. And the political economy perspective actually goes back to this very fact that I told you, which is when we think of Kurdish history, we almost always think about Kurdish history in relation to one and trajectory of evolving Kurdish statelessness, which focuses on the political processes, political developments. Two, either as a failure of development of Kurdish nationalism or a celebration of the evolution of Kurdish nationalism. So, in all of these discussions, to a great extent, the political economy is, peripheral or on the margins of our thought process. So, in the 19th century, Kurdistan or concerning generally the late Ottoman history, Kurdish, Armenian populated parts of the empire, the history of this region had been narrated mostly from an ethnic violence or ethnic religious relations point of view. And in those, there is an attempt to understand like why the Armenian genocide happened, why the pogroms against the Armenians took place, or violence against the Kurds in the late Ottoman, early Republican time period. And as a student of history back in time, I was reading these works. I was just like, I felt like there's something really missing here. Who owned what? Why is this person fighting? Like, why are they fighting at this particular moment? What did they simply have that changed in this particular context? I mean, basics of political economy that I was trying to understand, but I didn't have many answers to this. And then I read a dissertation written in 2002 by Janet Klein. And she was talking about how these militias deployed by the Kurdish militias, deployed by the Ottoman state, Hamidiye light cavalry, how that process was deeply embedded in an agrarian transformation or an agrarian question, at the core of which was the dispossession of the Armenian population and also the Kurdish population. But it was like at the core of this episode of Kurdish history, which was almost always narrated as an administrative or a political institution, there was like an profound agrarian economic issue at its core. And that was the moment that I was fascinated and I was like, yeah, this is what I am interested to know more about. And that's where I started to read more about, okay, agrarian transformations, rural dispossession, elite structures in an early modern economic context. And that brought me to the processes that culminated in my first book, The Kurdish Nobility, because I was asking this question, okay, something is changing in the 19th century because the conventional story is about how Kurdish principalities lost their power within the context of modernization as the Ottoman state tried to centralize its economic and fiscal structures. But then I was asking this question, okay, but what is it that they are fighting against? What is unique about the Kurdish elites that the Ottoman state had a problem with and tried to attack in the 19th century? And I went backwards. That's why the book is almost 400 pages. So I wanted to understand what these noble households looked like economically, and how did the structure change over the course of the 3 centuries that they stayed within the Ottoman realm, and how did modernity or modern ruling technologies transform this. And so we have to go back to the 16th century because remember I told you Ottoman state operated on different modalities of autonomy. And for the Kurds in the 16th century, it meant two ways in which they had recognized privileges, and privilege in quotation marks. And I explained this in the book because what the Ottomans described as privilege was really an ongoing structure or right for the Kurdish nobles for several centuries. And it involved basically two things. One, the Kurdish autonomous households, they wouldn't be paying any taxes to the Ottoman state. That's at the core of the economic privilege. And two, they they will not allow any Ottoman administrators, whether civilian or military, into their respective territories. And that is something that was recognized by fermans or decrees by the Ottoman sultans and had a great degree of continuity until they were formally abolished in the mid 19th century. So and then the next question, now I established that, okay, I understand what is the basis of their political power. What is the economic basis of their political power? Next question was, okay, what is happening in the realm of extraction in the early modern context? This is an overwhelmingly agrarian society. Who produces what? Who are the agrarian producers? What is the instruments of surplus extraction? And what are the ways in which this specific surplus extraction system affects social relations, intercommunal relations in a given part of Kurdistan? And that brought me to the analysis of, you know, Kurdish principalities or Kurdish noble families, their economic privileges, and how they actually use these privileges in terms of their governing of these diverse populations, Kurdish and Armenian, and how this changed over time, especially when the Ottoman state claimed a bigger share or a more direct way in which they wanted to extract agrarian surplus.
Can I ask you about the social circulation of Kurdishness historically and today? Because, as always, the roots of today are in the past as well as in the future. And it's about what it seems to me are two stereotypes that circulate very powerfully. One is Kurds as victims, and the other is Kurds as terrorists.
Mhm.
The latter obviously associated with the modern Turkish state, and in particular the contemporary Turkish state, and something that you must have grown up with and experienced at some level as a Kurdish Turkish woman. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about my binary of victim terrorist,
Mhm.
which is very
Yes,
crude, but maybe suggestive. I'd love to know your response.
it really is suggestive. I mean, a cursory look at news media or, like the popular notions of Kurdishness, we will see that yes, victim narrative and terrorist narrative. But to that, can I add a third one, which came from the Rojava experience and the fight against ISIS, and that is the, female uh, Kurdish guerrillas of YPG and the Western media basically use those images of female guerrillas to, in a very romanticized way, I would say. And that added another unidimensional description of what Kurds are, who Kurds are, and what Kurdishness
Mm.
entails.
Mhm.
And about the victim narrative, this is something I really try to complicate in my historical scholarship. And it is tempting. This victim narrative is tempting because it almost always is an discursive or narrative tool, one either to justify the current state of affairs or to show sympathy, to show sympathy to Kurds and to understand their current difficulties. There is this victim narrative that we see in news media and in scholarship as well. And also, that is a self produced narrative as well. Because for a lot of political, scholarly, or even journalistic accounts that are produced by Kurds themselves, there is a narrative. Oh, actually, there is a binary here. Kurds being the victims of the historical processes in the last century and heroic resistance,
Mhm. Right, right.
So that's these two narratives actually go hand in hand. And the other one that you mentioned is also very accurate, terrorists, Kurds as terrorists. And that came primarily from the Turkish experience because of, the PKK with the Turkish state's insistence was put on the international terrorist lists, terrorist organizations list, recognized as a terrorist organization by the US and European Union, so on and so forth. So, but then even beyond that, Kurds as terrorists comes from all these nation states they want to suppress, you know, cultural and political rights of Kurds in their nation states. We have a similar narrative in Iran, and it comes almost always with, oh, we have no problem with Kurds, we have a problem with terrorists. And so that basically tries to limit Kurdishness to an recognized type that the contours of which could only be defined by the states themselves. And if you go beyond that, if you want to talk about Kurdishness in a different way, then that's a problem. You're not allowed to talk about Kurdishness in ways that could go beyond the boundaries defined by these nation states. So it is your description is pretty accurate. And um, my preoccupation as an historian, as a scholar of Kurdish studies,
Right.
is less with the states and the discourses produced by the state, because I wouldn't expect otherwise, right? The states describe Kurds as, I mean, in particular ways, and that is really not something that I am concerned with. What I'm concerned with is mostly the discourses that I see produced by the people who want to show sympathy, understand the Kurdish cause and Kurdish plight, and also self narratives. I talk about this in relation to, for example, processes that resulted in Kurdish statelessness in the aftermath of World War I, because most Kurdish self-generated narrative is about victimhood and failure, and also there's one more thing. Oh, inability to create a united front. But when we look closely into the historical context in which Kurds actually struggled to have a state, the parameters are beyond Kurdish abilities or Kurdish inabilities. There is like larger regional, structural, international processes that create a certain outcome in a certain moment. But the contemporary, this historical discourses, uh, it's kind of as when Kurds talk about Kurdish failure, it's actually a present-oriented narrative because they are
Mhm.
trying to make a point about what is happening right now, right? We have to have a unified front. We have to talk about Kurdish unity. So a critique of the past is actually a message about the present, right? But the message, I think, gets lost on the way because we know less about the past than we know what is happening this week in Syria or what is happening this week in Iran. That's why my major preoccupation is to deconstruct and reconstruct these narratives in a way that does not reproduce Kurds as victims, or as victims or of processes that they can't really change and they were powerless.
So this is getting away from failure, from a
Yeah.
focus on failure and disaster.
Mhm.
I wanted to go in a slightly different direction, Prof, because of my secret cells of agents around the world who don't know one another's identities but report to me. I believe that you have a past in acting. I wanted to ask you about that, but first, before we get on to that, talk a bit about the context of Ottomanism on screen. Starting about 10 years ago, hundreds, if not thousands, of children in this part of the world suddenly have Turkish names as
Oh, okay. I
in
see where
amongst
you're getting at.
in amongst their Spanish names, right? So they will have one of your names with a Spanish word, or two of your names with two Spanish words. Really, really common. Why is this? Well, you know as well as I do, it's the 1001 Nights, but it's lots of other novelas or soap operas that have become incredibly popular in other countries, actually in Sweden too, where there are quite a lot of Kurds anyway. But Ottoman stories in terms of grandeur, beauty, wealth, power, violence, that's the Latin American formula for aspirational viewers. And they love these beautiful Turkish men and women on screen in these historical epics. And they've just spread like wildfire, starting in Chile and then moving to here, Mexico, Argentina, you name it. And I'm sure you're aware of this phenomenon. Now, I'm not going to hold you responsible for that because you did the other end of it, as it were, where you would take films and TV shows from other countries and be a
Yeah.
voiceover actor for Turks and others. But this fascinates me, this kind of cultural transfer, but it's not necessarily innocent.
No.
So I wanted to ask you about your experience of cultural transfer at the other end,
Yeah.
but also if you've got thoughts about the fact that there are all these little Latin Americans running around, named
Yeah.
like AJ or Bilkai, whatever.
That is so interesting. Um, well, okay, this is well, let first a reservation here. I'm not a cultural studies scholar. So this is not although I talk about cultural aspects of Turkish history in my modern Turkey class, this is not a research field for me. But let me tell you one thing. I didn't know about the name thing, so I'm really intrigued, particularly because my name in one of the very popular shows is the name of a very bad character that everybody hates. So I hope that won't be, I don't think my name would be popular among Latin American audiences. But okay, so yeah, I'm not a cultural studies scholar. However, often I tell my husband that, well, if I were to change my field, if I were to, stop being an Ottoman historian, I don't need to do any field work, any research, because I have a ready, just done research with Turkish soap operas. So all it takes for me is to improve my theoretical background on the issue. Why do I say this? Because you might find this interesting because when I came to the United States in 2005, of course, it was like a big cultural transition for me,
Yeah.
this sense of loneliness because I grew up in a big city, I studied in Istanbul. So coming to Binghamton, a very small place with not much going on, that sense of being isolated and loneliness For the first time in my life, I started watching Turkish soap operas in 2005. Before that, I rarely watched TV, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But then in 2005, I started watching. And then as I started watching these Turkish soap operas, the market extended tremendously. And then the shows got longer. Every episode is now around like 2.5 hours. So it became something, a phenomenon in and of itself in the past 20 years. And yes, it's not all that innocent because one, the at some point there was a convergence between the Turkish state's new foreign policy based on neo-Ottomanism, and which is based on the idea that we will revitalize the Ottomanness in the Middle East, and we will basically be an important political actor. And then Syrian war gave a convenient opportunity, and then Syria, and then Libya, and then the reconstruction of Syria, so on and so forth. So the for the Turkish soap operas to be very popular, that there was like a convenient diplomatic, political, cultural context for that to happen. And it is interesting because for a long time, especially in the Arab world, Ottoman past was known as like a period of colonial oppression, right? And then scholarship tried to challenge that. But what the scholarship did was like, maybe 20% improvement in that scholarship really was reversed with this new soap opera context because the Ottomans were now portrayed in another essentialist way as the imperial ruler that will save us from European and American empire and imperialism. Now, that's the political context for that. But two things that I really want to emphasize here. One, there are different genres within the Turkish soap opera context, right? There is the rich guy and then the poor woman, or poor guy, rich woman. There's always a rich family because you have to make it appealing to the people whose everyday life is not based on similar ways of consumption, but it is, aspiring. It's a world that they can aspire to. But at the same time, there's another genre. That genre is based in Kurdistan. And that is like a textbook definition of Orientalist gaze, orientalizing, essentializing, eroticizing look at the Kurdish population. There is always like a Kurdish awe or the tribal chief, but a modern way, or like a modernized man who received education outside of Kurdistan and came to modernize and fix the problems with the traditional society. So that's a very common genre. But then that is a beyond that, there's a very dehumanizing portrayal of the Kurdish society, right? They slaughter their own daughters. There is like killings for the for honor, and of course, when we think about stereotypes, the point is not the truth value, right? The point is not whether these happen or not. Yes, these things happen. But the point is to basically, overgeneralize and superimpose these specific selective aspects of a culture or a population and describe an entire group of people referring to these episodes or these cases. So that's one problem. And the second thing is, I don't know if you have seen these shows. There's, these beautiful women, good-looking men, enormous consumption, beautiful houses, dresses, and all. But there is an embedded whiteness in these shows in terms of how the characters are shown. Just watching these shows, people in South America might think that 90% of the Turkish population have blue eyes, pale skin, and blonde hair. So that is, really feeding into this idea of whiteness, which is something that is praised and preferred in a lot of in most parts of the global South. So let me put it that way. Um, yeah, as you see, I am pretty well informed in
I
the
know. Look, you told your husband the truth. If you changed areas, it wouldn't take much. You already know all this stuff. But can I take us back to where I began, which is actually that you've been on the other side of cultural transfer.
Oh.
Could you talk a wee bit about that? And I don't think this is on your CV, Prof.
No, it is, yeah, funny you say that because I like for a long time I it never occurred to me to talk about this. And it was only when like a few years ago my colleague we did a podcast for Ottoman History podcast. I just casually told him, look, I used to be a voice actress back in Turkey. I started as a kid. That's when it occurred to me that, well, I did this for about like 20 years. Why do I never think about this? And I think, and I figured it out, and I will tell you why. So let me tell you how I started. Like years ago, a little bit of cultural, institutional history of Turkey's cultural landscape. In Turkey, when I grew up in the 1980s and 90s, there was only one official channel. There was only one TV channel. And there were then a few more, but these were all, official state TV channels. Only in the 1990s we started to have private TV channels, and that was like a huge transformation of media cultural landscape in Turkey. And there was also radio, right? The radio channels were also state owned. And I grew up in Izmir, which is in the western part of Turkey, historically known as Smyrna. And it is, a Turkish orient, I mean, primarily Turkish culture and, secular Turkish, etc. So my family moved there when I was 1 year old. My mother is Kurdish, my father is Turkish, but I grew up in a Turkish spoken context. And as you can tell from this podcast, I like to chat even when I was a young kid. I like to have conversation with people. And my mother, noticing that, took me to because like the Turkish broadcasting, TRT, I forgot what it stands for, but like official Turkish media institution, they would have, every 5 year or so, this massive auditions for children. Yeah, children who would actually be actors in their radio plays regularly. And my mom, of course, took me to there because like I spoke a lot. And it is very interesting now looking back how they took this seriously was very interesting because there was about 3,000 kids who applied to this at the time. And there was 3 rounds of selection. And at the end of the second exam or the audition, let me put it that way, we received like a full 3 months education from the most famous actors of Turkey at the time. So that's how I started, doing the radio plays and this regular radio show that I acted for several years. But on top of that, I would also do, voice acting, dubbing, the documentaries, cartoons, and other things. And until I moved to the United States, I did this. And I think I thought about this. Why do I never think of this as a part of my past?
Mm, mm.
It might have affected me in really serious ways because now looking back now I have an 11-year-old. How did I even stay quiet for several hours, making any noise as an 8-year-old child? It must be very difficult, but they were very strict. I think it is because I was kind of embarrassed because it was the Turkish official channel and working there for so long, might have felt like this is a controversial thing to do as someone who works on this and that. But now, in my current age, I think that's an important part of my past,
Yeah.
which might have affected me in important ways in character building, etc.
So when you speak Turkish, are you identifiable as somebody with a Kurdish background?
I personally am not because I grew up in Izmir and I don't have an accent in my Turkish because I didn't grow up learning Kurdish. So assimilation in my family started way before my generation. My
Yeah.
mom spoke Turkish with her parents. Even though my grandparents spoke Kurdish, they spoke Turkish. Imagine this is like my grandparents' generation is
Mm,
19. They were born in 1920s, 30s, and
mm.
this is really the very what was the word that you said? Energized period of Turkish state's assimilation and state building.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
no, me personally, I'm not. I'm not recognizable because I don't have an accent in
So that
Turkish.
wasn't
But
that was sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead.
So that wasn't a problem in inverted commas when you were doing voice acting.
No, it was
Because
not.
you
Because
were
I didn't
Turkish
have an
born.
accent.
Yeah.
But we frequently code switched. When I spoke
Mhm.
with my family, I have some sort of, some accents that comes from the
Yep.
local dialects, but I didn't have that in public.
And of course, little bit of context, Izmir is the liberal hub of Turkey. So you grew up in the place that is more progressive, less fundamentalist religiously, more
Mhm.
open to progressive ideas. That's the stereotype anyway, isn't it?
Mhm. Yes. Yes, that's the stereotype. And just like any stereotype, it has a kernel of truth to it, but that has to be definitely, like you said, deconstructed and there are a lot of layers to it. So yes, Izmir or Smyrna in the past
Hmm.
is known for. I mean, at least in modern Turkey, it is like it's the most westernized, most modernized face of Turkey. That's how it is marketed, because it's secular. It's typically for a lot of for decades they voted for. The Republican Party. Not, it is very different from the American context, but it is the secular nationalist, slightly left-wing oriented compared to the Islamist right-wing branches of Turkish politics. But growing up in Izmir, I always had this resentment. Resentment in the sense that I knew what was beyond that facade, which is extreme forms of racism against the Kurds and Kurdish populations. So my family, they were very strict about one thing. I was never allowed to say that I am from Izmir. When someone asks you, okay, what's your hometown? Where are you from? Um, and it's like a daily, this is a conversation starter in Turkey. Take a cab. That's the first question that you get. And I was really not allowed to say that I'm from Izmir, even though they moved there when I was 1 year old. And that was all I knew until I went to college in Istanbul. I was expected to say I'm from Van, not from Izmir. My family moved to Izmir. Because I think in their mind that was like an effort. Now in hindsight, I understand why they wanted me to do that. A way of protecting the origins, the culture, or the difference, maintain the difference. But I remember, you know, um, we never said that we are Kurds. I mean, not that because like it was something learned because of, necessity that they would describe as, oh, they are Doğulu, they are from the East. So that was is euphemism a good word to describe that? They would
Mm.
say we are from the East, but no one would use the word Kurd. I don't remember any time that they would say, "Oh, this family is Kurdish," or half of the family is Kurdish. They would never mention that, especially because in the 1990s the war was continuing in Kurdistan and the political context was quite rough and everybody but was scared, and so I think that might have also had an impact on it. But I think that resentment about Izmir, or hypocrisy, if you will, cultural societal hypocrisy, priding themselves on being welcoming and secular and all the liberal facade concealed the deep embedded sense of racism against Kurds, and that's why I was and I still am is resentful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And this story of assimilation or integration or denial of difference is such a profound one for people. And it really is something that comes with the nation state, with empire, with hypermasculinity, with
Mhm.
religion, all these massive forces of the modern world. Prof, I want to thank you very much for being with us. It's been fantastic chatting to you. I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to add as a means of concluding matters. Could be something we've touched on, but where you want to say a bit more, or might be a topic that we haven't addressed.
No, I want to make a comment about the podcast and how it worked for me, my experience of this. And having done this in different ways, I really enjoyed this, the way that we did this today. It allowed me to bring different aspects of what make me Nilay, as someone who um, is not just a researcher, not just a scholar, but, as complex as any other human being. And it gave me an opportunity to enjoy the flow of the conversation. And without being really that structured, I enjoyed talking about things that dynamizes in a very natural way. So thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed the conversation as it took place in this way.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful feedback. It's greatly appreciated. Happy days.
Thank you. You